Hi everyone, my name is Taylor Wolford and I am a Special Collections Librarian at NC State University Libraries. Today I am joined by my colleague Laura Lethers, who is a processing assistant with the libraries, and we are going to be discussing emotional labor and emotion regulation strategies and archive settings. I asked Laura to join us today so that she could go into a little bit more depth about working on historical collections of a graphic, disturbing, and violent nature, which speaks in a lot of ways to the topic of emotional labor and emotion regulation strategies in the archives. I did want to give a brief content warning before Laura begins. This presentation will cover topics such as trauma, grief, violence, and emotional labor. If at any point you feel overwhelmed or would like to turn the camera off and mute me, please feel free to do so. And for now, I'm going to hand it over to Laura to talk a little bit more about emotional labor in the archives workplace.
Hi everyone, as Taylor mentioned, my name is Laura, and she asked me to share a little of my own experience with emotional labor with you all today. First, for a little bit of background, I began working on animal rights and welfare collections with Taylor in September of last year. In my previous year of processing at NC State, I had not come across materials that I would have considered emotionally disturbing in any way. And when I started working with animal rights collections, I was also in a unique position in that I was aware of Taylor's research into emotional labor before I came into contact with these materials. Because of this, I came into processing these collections with a rudimentary understanding of emotional labor that I did not previously have. It was made clear to me from my introduction to the animal rights collections that I might come across some photographs or documents that I might find personally difficult to deal with. Taylor had been working on similar materials already, so she essentially gave me a content warning for the collection. She told me to let her know if I needed to take breaks or if anything was ever affecting me too much. I remember a few weeks into processing, I was working on a box of materials that were seemingly innocuous. They were basic, straightforward organizational documents. So when I came across depictions of animal cruelty while processing that carton, I was somewhat blindsided by their inclusion. My emotional response at the time was shock, which transitioned into an odd sort of inevitability. I knew I had been forewarned about this, and so I told myself that I needed to deal with it. I remember asking Taylor about the photograph only because I wondered if it should be moved into the photograph series rather than remaining in the carton. When I told her what it was, she asked me if I was okay. I told her yes and followed it up with, "You told me that this would happen eventually." Her response was, "Well, yeah, but that doesn't mean you have to be okay with it." Now, was I truly okay at the time? Of course not. But I have never been the type of person who quickly reveals feelings of discomfort. I remember it took me a few minutes to be able to move on to the rest of the carton. I even spared a thought for future researchers, thinking that they might be as blindsided by that as I was, given the nature of the rest of the materials surrounding it. The emotional response strategy I chose at the time was to direct my attention away from what I found disturbing and continue processing the carton. After months of working with these collections, I became less and less surprised by the materials that I found. Does that mean that I am used to working with them? No. There have been days when I have seen something and thought, I definitely did not need to see that today, and other days where I share things with Taylor just to ease the emotional pressure. I have my own animals, and photographs of animal cruelty hit too close to home for me. I like to think I've gotten better at allowing myself to feel whatever it is I'm feeling in the moment, rather than simply burying the emotion. I don't often think about it outside of work, but sometimes things I have seen follow me home. At times, I find working with these collections to be very emotionally draining, and it does sometimes affect my mood both during and after work. I find myself choosing cartons that are less likely to upset me in between the ones that have proven difficult. Or I might take a brain break and work on another project, or even switch over to data entry for a few hours instead. I found ways to cope, and I was very glad when we completed the photograph series. Other materials might not be a walk in the park, but reading something has always affected me differently than seeing it through images. I am very grateful to Taylor and my other colleagues at State for being understanding about the emotional toll and for being supportive throughout this processing project. Before working with these materials, it had never really occurred to me that there might come a time when I would be so affected by my processing work. Some discomfort was expected, but not to the degree I was experiencing it with these materials. When Taylor requested that I share a little of my experience with emotional labor, I agreed because it is something that I know happens to other people, and I think it should be addressed more within the profession. I'll turn it back over to Taylor for the rest of her presentation.
Thank you, Laura, for giving us such a great example of emotional labor in the archives. First, I wanted to get us all started with a working definition of emotional labor. According to psychologist Alice Grandy, emotional labor is the management of one's emotions in response to display rules for the organization or job, and requires enhancing, faking, or suppressing emotions to modify emotional expression. A great example of this is anyone working in public services. Perhaps you are dealing with an uncooperative or upset patron, which in turn makes you feel upset internally, but you know that externally, because of the requirements and display rules of your job, you must display a public services persona that is misaligned with how you feel internally. That is a great example of emotional labor, is sort of faking or suppressing your emotions in a public services setting so that you are in line with what is expected of the job at the time. I conducted quite an extensive literature review on this topic to see if there were any gaps in the literature or key themes. There's a really fantastic article by Madison and Miller in which they suggest librarians are trained to suppress negative emotions and convey positive emotions as a primary form of emotional labor. Another interesting facet of their argument is that they believe this standard is upheld by professional norms and practices. Their work connects really well with a study conducted at Kent State University, in which the researchers analyzed the negative effects of emotional labor, which may include emotional exhaustion, cynicism, and lower job satisfaction. And yet another great article discusses how emotional labor is directly linked to burnout in libraries. And according to DeVille, burnout leads to overwhelming exhaustion, feeling depleted of emotional and physical resources, a sense of ineffectiveness, and a lack of accomplishment. Another really interesting theme that I pulled from the research comes from an article by Schomburg, in which they argue that those of a minority class, ethnicity, or nationality experience the negative effects of emotional labor more acutely. Additionally, individuals who are older, disabled, with less education, or aren't cis men may experience emotional labor because of the imbalance in power that occurs in the workplace. Lastly, I wanted to get into a brief discussion of an article written by Elvia Ramirez on suspended grief. Ramirez has done some fantastic work on emotional labor and radical empathy in the archives, but in one of their recent articles, they discuss how working with donors, records creators, communities, and traumatic historical documents became a form of suspended grief and also a role requirement for archival processing. According to Ramirez, suspended grief is grief or trauma that is witnessed, experienced, or relived in an archive or library setting. And this is when personal trauma and professional trauma sort of intersect in the workplace in really interesting ways, especially as archivists are continuously interacting with communities and also traumatic historical documents. The primary method for data collection in the study was conducting semi-structured interviews, and the sample population was archivists, library staff, and student workers employed at an academic library for multiple years. It was a mixed method study where I gathered both qualitative and quantitative data for an analysis of participant interviews. The first thing that I coded for were examples of emotional labor, and I did this by coding for which situations tended to generate negative feelings in the participant. So the first situation code that happened most frequently was challenging work task, and in these situations, participants labeled working with historical materials as upsetting, disturbing, terrible, sad, draining, depressing, and uncomfortable. Overall, out of all of the situations that I coded for, processing and working with traumatic historical documents was the number one cause of emotional labor in the workplace. And I think that's really eye-opening for my own work, both as a supervisor and an archival processor in my current position. The second highest example of emotional labor in the interviews was overwhelming workload. And this is situations in which the participant expressed that they felt physically or mentally unable to keep up with work demands due to a fast pace, busy environment, competing demands, supervisory responsibilities, low staff, etc. The third highest frequency of emotional labor occurred in organizational and administrative situations, and this is when the library worker felt negative emotion due to organizational or administrative expectations. Essentially, the library worker felt what they could accomplish was misaligned with what the organization or administration wanted them to accomplish. And lastly, as I discussed previously, public services is another large source of emotional labor, specifically negative interactions with researchers in which we are required to express an outwardly emotion that we inwardly do not feel. For the most part with my study, I really wanted individuals' language, the participants' language, to speak for themselves, and for them to describe emotions and emotion regulation strategies in their own words. So I thought this infographic was really interesting because it both demonstrates the frequency but also the unique terms that individuals use to describe emotions in the workplace. So as you can see, words such as stressed, difficult, terrible, anxious, uncomfortable appeared most frequently throughout the interviews that I coded. And you can really see a range of emotions here from positive, neutral to negative. A major conclusion that I reached from this work is that few participants could provide insight on how to regulate stressful periods of work while managing a wide range of responsibilities, tasks, and projects. Library workers are often left without resources, training, and professional practices to process emotional labor and develop emotion regulation strategies to continue their work. When I was in graduate school, I had never heard of emotional labor prior to working on this study, and I was curious if other participants in this study had felt the same way, that maybe there was a lack of education or information about this in the field. So I asked everyone in my participant interviews, do you feel you were prepared for situations of emotional labor upon entering the workforce? And every participant said no. So I think that's a really interesting aspect of this discussion is what resources, what training, and what professional practices are we providing, not just for our new library professionals, but for our student workers, for the librarians, for the technical staff, for everyone who's involved in the day-to-day functions of a library system. I have a couple key recommendations that I have gathered based on my research and my work with the participants. And the first is that support for library workers should be embedded in our workflow and practices. Example of this in my own practice is I have begun informing candidates during the hiring process that they may be working with historical materials of a graphic and violent nature. If they're working with public services, I perhaps would warn them that they may occasionally be working with difficult patrons, but if at any point they do not feel comfortable or safe, they are more than welcome to let a staff member know, and they can handle the situation. I think this is especially important when interviewing potential student employees so that they do feel physically and psychologically safe in their workspace. There should also be more educational resources and training available for students and professionals engaged in library work to enrich their emotional intelligence skills. If we are a little bit more open and knowledgeable about what emotional labor is and how it can lead to things like burnout, perhaps we can come up with some creative solutions and develop a stronger community of care and support. Lastly, I argue that we should adopt a more trauma-informed approach to library services, which I will get to in the next slide. So there are 6 guiding principles to a trauma-informed approach. This infographic was originally designed by the CDC for emergency service workers, but I think it applies really well to work in library spaces. And essentially, I don't want to go through all of the different principles. They're quite extensive in terms of applications, but I do want to say my takeaway from this infographic is library workers need to feel comfortable talking about the negative aspects of our work, and we also need to reject narratives in this profession that suggest we can do more with less. Additionally, library workers at all stages of their career must feel safe and empowered to advocate for their own well-being in the workplace. And finally, there was a really interesting aspect of my participant interviews in which peer support and colleague mentorship was a great benefit to those experiencing the negative effects of social in emotional labor. So I would suggest, if you have any questions about the nuances of these 6 guiding principles of a trauma-informed approach, please feel free to contact me. I have left my email and contact information there. I'd like to thank everybody for listening today, and I hope that we can start to have open and honest discussions about our own experiences with emotional labor and how we can work together moving forward. I also have quite an extensive bibliography. If anyone's interested in learning more about this topic, please feel free to reach out, and I will hopefully talk to y'all soon.